In the last video, we talked about divergent and convergent thinking, and we discussed how divergent thinking refers to ideation that calls for lots and lots of equally viable solutions or ideas or responses to a question or a problem. On the other hand, we also talked about convergent thinking as ideation that calls for one singular correct response. So we have divergent thinking, and on the other hand, we have convergent thinking. Now, when we're talking about diverging effectively, what are some of the ways that we do that? How do we do it? How do we come up with lots and lots of ideas? How do we generate all those many ideas that we want to come up with in an effective way? Luckily, this is something that has already been ironed out for us, and it was done in the 1940s by a gentleman named Alex Osborne. Alex Osborne was the CEO of an American advertising company, and he developed brainstorming as a process for problem solving. He conceptualized or thought of brainstorming as a series of back and forths between divergent and convergent thinking, and based on his experiences and observations, he came up with 4 guidelines for brainstorming. These guidelines for brainstorming are quite effective as best practices for doing solid brainstorming and solid divergent thinking. The first guideline is to strive for quantity. And generally, what striving for quantity means is you want to come up with lots and lots of ideas. The first ideas that people come up with aren't the most interesting. They aren't the most innovative. They aren't the most original or unusual ideas that they come up with. They aren't really the coolest or best ones. So, what we want to do is we want to strive to come up with many, many ideas. And generally what I recommend is to usually aim for at least 20 ideas. So every time you brainstorm, you want to come up with at least 20. And really, once you build up your ideational capacities, you want to build your divergent thinking musculature and strive to come up with even more. You want to come up with maybe 30 ideas each and every time you brainstorm. The second guideline is to defer judgment. Quite often what happens when we're coming up with ideas, especially when we're doing this in groups, but also independently, is we start to analyze. We start to analyze our own ideas and the ideas of others. We start to have discussions about it, saying things like, oh, well, what do you mean by that idea? Is that a good idea? Is that realistic? Is that original? Is that even something that we should accept? That sort of analytical discussion, that is something that is detrimental to the brainstorming process and really to creativity in general. What we want to do is we want to take our analytic thought, we want to take our analysis, take our critical thinking, and we want to back burner it. We want to defer it. We want to push it off until later. For the time being, what we want to do is we want to just welcome all of the ideas into the room. We want to nod them in. We want to affirm them. And then we just want to re-ask the question and keep coming up with more and more ideas. So deferring judgment is the second guideline for brainstorming. And it's probably the most important one. In fact, I'll go out on a limb and say that it is the most important one in my view. So the first guideline is to strive for quantity. We want to come up with tons and tons and tons of ideas. And the second guideline is to defer judgment. The third guideline is to freewheel. Now the first 2 of these guidelines, to strive for quantity and to defer judgment, they're really best practices. And the third and fourth, I like to think of them more as strategies to use when you hit a wall in your brainstorming. They're strategies for when you get stuck, when the ideation flow starts to wane, when the pace starts to slow and you feel like you don't really have any more ideas. So here are those 2 strategies that Osborne came up with to stimulate your divergent thinking process, your ideational flow, if you will. So the third guideline for brainstorming is to freewheel. What is freewheeling? Freewheeling really means popping a wheelie on a bike. It means letting loose the wildest ideas that you could think of. So that's freewheeling, the third guideline. It's a really good strategy for when you hit a wall. The fourth guideline is another good strategy for when the flow of ideas starts to wane and wither. This strategy involves building off other ideas that are already in the idea set that you've come up with. Something that we don't like to do in our everyday life is we don't want to copy other people's ideas. And we don't really want to do that here. But When you hit a wall, it's not really a bad practice, it's not a bad strategy to look at other ideas that you've already come up with and try to build off of them. You might ask, how could we build off this idea or that idea to make it more extreme? How could we build off it in a way that might be unexpected or original or unique? How could we combine a couple ideas that are already up on the board? So that's the fourth guideline, and it's called hitchhiking. It's called hitchhiking because you're really hitching a ride off a previous idea. So, 4 guidelines for brainstorming. We strive for quantity to come up with as many ideas as possible. We defer judgment. You can see that I've circled it in red because that's really the key to effective divergent thinking, to effective brainstorming. And then when you hit a wall, when the flow of ideas starts to slow, when it starts to wane, you can freewheel. You can use the 3rd guideline. You can come up with some wild ideas. Or you can hitchhike. You can rely on the 4th guideline. You could look at some of the other ideas that are already up on the board and try to build off them in some unique and unusual way. So, those are the 4 guidelines for brainstorming, and they really include some helpful best practices and strategies for effective brainstorming.